The civil rights movement was organized by African American citizens to fight against inequality. The movement started in the 1940s and finished in the 1960s. Numerous people played vital roles in the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, many black citizens were stripped from voting rights and other opportunities that all people now have. African American citizens started the movement with hopes for a better and more equal world. They organized marches and boycotts, such as the Washington, D.C. March on August 28th, which had between 200,000 to 500,000 volunteers. Also, they spoke about injustice to get people's attention and in order to rise up. African Americans worked together to get the same rights as white people. Adults, elderly, and even students resisted the inequality. At the beginning of the 60s, all schools and universities were united, and the success in Montgomery led to the emergence of human rights organizations in all cities. However, not all enterprises or schools were corresponded with these changes, and black students began to demonstrate the fact that inequality existed by organizing so-called sit-ins. On February 1st, four black students from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College sat down at the counter and asked to be served. They knew that this would not happen because the counter that they sat was only for white people. However, they refused to stand up until they were forced to leave because the shop was closed. The next day, a much larger group of students appeared either to participate or to participate in a sit-in. After that, newspapers and civil rights groups learned about this activity, and sit-ins were led in several cities in the country. That wasn't the only event that happened during the civil rights movement. One of the most dramatic and dangerous events of the civil rights movement was the Freedom Ride. It was organized in 1951 by the Congress of Racial Equality, a civil rights group which was planning to start a nonviolent action. A decade earlier, the U.S. Supreme Court had already announced separatism on interstate buses and in interstate terminals unconstitutional. Even with this decision, buses and other stations remained separated. In May 1961, black and white citizens got on a bus heading to the southern states. At first, the riders met some resistance, but in Alabama all went worse. Some white people attacked one of these buses with the Fighters for Civil Rights. They burned the bus and killed the people when they were getting out. Outside of Birmingham, Alabama, when the second bus stopped, 8 white people got on the bus and brutally beat the non-violent riders for civil rights. During the movement, there were a lot of civil rights groups which helped the people to fight together. One of the strongest leaders and opponents in a separate civil rights groups was Ella Baker. Ella Baker was born in 1903 in Norfolk, Virginia, and she died at the age of 83 on December 13, 1986 in New York City. According to deiteproject.org, aarp.org, and biography.com, quote, Ella Josephine Baker developed a sense for social justice early in her life. As a girl growing up in North Carolina, Baker listened to her grandmother tell stories about slave revolts. An enslaved woman, her grandmother had been whipped for refusing to marry a man chosen for her by the slave owner. Baker studied at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. As a student, she challenged school policies that she thought were unfair. After graduating in 1927 as class valedictorian, Baker moved to New York City and began joining social activist organizations. In 1930, Ella Baker joined Cooperative League of Young Blacks, which had the goal to develop black economic power through collective planning. Also, Baker participated in a couple women organizations. She was committed to the principles of economic equality for all people, and once she said, quote, "People cannot be free until there is enough work on this earth to give everyone work." End quote. Ella Baker had a backstage career spanning over 5 decades. She worked with a lot of known civil rights leaders, including Reverend Martin Luther King, Philip Randolph, and Thurgood Marshall. In 1957, Ella Baker was asked by Martin Luther King to become director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Quote, Baker continued to fight for social justice and equality into her later years, providing to different organizations. Unquote. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference is an African-American civil rights organization with its first president as Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King had an important role in the civil rights movement, which victoriously staged a 321-day protest of the Montgomery, Alabama's separated bus system. The SCLC was based in Atlanta, Georgia, at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, and advocated opposing segregation through civil disagreement. This action included marches, boycotts, and protests in non-harmful ways. The SCLC leadership, most of whom were ministers, also thought that churches should be included in political activity and conducted many of their meetings in black churches. They became an important symbol in civil rights movement. In 1962, SCLC began to expand its focus to include issues of economic inequality. SCLC launched Operation Bread Basket in Atlanta to create new jobs in the black community. In 1966, the program extended to Chicago as part of the Chicago Campaign. After 1 year, planning began for a Poor People's Campaign to bring thousands of people to Washington, D.C. to promote federal legislation that would guarantee income, employment, and housing for economically marginalized people for all nationalities. The assassination of Martin Luther King on April 4, 1968 undermined the SCLC momentum and crippled the success of the Poor People's Campaign. The organization, which was often in the shadow of an outstanding leader, updated plans for a demonstration in Washington as a tribute to the King. 3,000 people temporarily occupied Washington, D.C. from May 13 to July 24, 1968, under the control of a new SCLC president, Ralph Abernathy. SCLC is now a nationwide organization with offices and affiliates throughout the United States. Its headquarters is located in Atlanta. It remains a commitment to nonviolent action to achieve social, economic, and political equality. Also, the organization is concentrated on other different topics such as racial profiling, police brutality, hate crimes, and discrimination. During the civil rights movement, all the people worked very hard. For example, the SCLC was created by Martin Luther King with Ella Baker's help. Also, she supported and motivated numerous other organizations on their struggle for civil rights. They fought for years until they finally achieved what they wanted. April 11, 1968, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1968, giving equal opportunities, religion, and national origin. Now we are very proud of them, of the fighters of the civil rights movement.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.